Before Britain became an island, it was not truly separate. Beneath what is now the cold North Sea, there were rivers, marshes, forests, animals, and human footsteps moving across a lost lowland between Europe and the western edge of the world they knew. Then the sea rose, slowly at first, and one great wave may have crossed that fading land like a final breath from the ocean. What does it mean when a homeland disappears so completely that only the seabed remembers it? 8,200 years ago, how did a single wave swallow an entire continent and create Britain? Long before Britain was called Britain, before its cliffs became a border in the mind, the land did not end where the sea ends today. The eastern shore of what is now England opened into a broad, low world, a place that modern eyes can only imagine beneath the North Sea. There were no white lines on a map, no nation standing apart from Europe, no island story yet. There was ground. There were river channels cutting through soft earth. There were shallow lakes and marsh edges, patches of woodland, damp hollows, and open spaces where animals moved with the seasons. To the people who lived in that age, this was not a lost continent. It was simply part of the world beneath their feet. A person could move from the land that would later become the Netherlands or northern Germany toward the land that would later become England without crossing a wide sea. The journey would not have been simple or empty. It would have passed through changing terrain, through wet ground, through river mouths, through areas where food, shelter, and danger shifted with season. Yet the central fact remains calm and powerful. Britain began as something connected. Its later separateness was not the starting point. It was the result of water, warming, ice melt, and time. This matters because human history often begins with the shape of the land before it begins with names. Long before written memory, long before kings, ships, borders, or languages we can identify, human lives were guided by coastlines that were not yet fixed. The people of Mesolithic Europe lived after the coldest grip of the last ice age had loosened. They were not standing at the edge of a finished world. They were living inside a changing one. The land bridge between Britain and the continent was not a narrow road in the modern sense. It was a living landscape, wide enough to hold rivers, plants, animals, and human movement. Today we often picture Britain as separate, surrounded by water, turned toward the sea, but that image belongs to a later chapter. In the older world, the western edge of Europe stretched farther into what is now seabed. The North Sea was not yet the North Sea as we know it. Much of it was lowland, shaped by ice that had retreated and by water that had not yet taken everything back. For human beings, this geography was not background. It was survival, where rivers bent, fish could gather, where marshes opened, birds and animals could be found, where higher ground rose above wetland. A group might stop, repair tools, share food, or wait for the next movement of the year. We cannot name those people, and we should not pretend to know their private thoughts, but we can understand the conditions around them. Their bodies needed warmth, calories, fresh water, sleep, and social closeness, just as bodies do now. Their knowledge was not written in books. It lived in repeated paths, remembered places, skill with stone, wood, skin, bone, fire, and weather. In that sense, the beginning of this story is not a disaster. It is a human landscape before the loss. The shock comes when we compare that old connected world with the map we carry today. A place now hidden underwater once helped link people, animals, and environments across northwestern Europe. Its disappearance did not merely change a coastline. It changed the routes by which life could move. It narrowed choices. It turned familiar directions into water. Later, when Britain stood apart as an island, that islandness would feel ancient, as if it had always been true. But the seabed tells a quieter story. It says separation can be made slowly. It says what looks permanent may once have been a passage. It says before Britain was surrounded by sea, it belonged to a wider human ground. What modern maps call the North Sea was once, in part, a broad and low landscape that archaeologists and geologists often describe as Doggerland. The name is modern, taken from the Dogger Bank, a raised area of seabed known to fishermen, not from the people who lived there. Those people left no written name for the country beneath the water, and it is more honest to begin with that silence. We are looking at a place that can be studied through traces, not remembered through its own words. Still, the traces are enough to show that this was not empty ground. It was a changing mixture of river valleys, marshes, lakes, woodland, grassier openings, and shorelines that moved as the climate warmed after the last ice age. To human bodies living there, these were not separate features on a scientific diagram. They were the places where thirst could be answered, where fish might be caught, where reeds could hide birds, where animals crossed soft ground, and where a small group might find a sheltered rise above damp earth. The lost world was low, and that is the key to its fate. Low land can be rich, because water brings life. It can also be fragile, because water does not have to climb far before it begins to take the ground back. Doggerland probably offered many kinds of food within reachable distance. Rivers and wetlands can hold fish, shellfish, water birds, plants, and mammals drawn to drinking places. Nearby drier ground can offer wood, stone carried by rivers or glaciers, and paths for larger animals. For hunter-gatherer groups, such variety mattered. A landscape with many edges between water and land, forest and open ground, fresh water and salt water, could support movement through the year. People did not need cities or fields to know such a place deeply. Their survival depended on attention. A bend in a channel, a patch of higher soil, a seasonal gathering place for animals, a place where dry wood could be found after rain. These details could hold real value. Yet, we must keep the picture careful. We cannot draw exact villages across Doggerland as if the seabed had given us a clear map of every camp. We cannot say how one family spoke about the marsh, or what stories were told beside a fire. What can be said is simpler and stronger. This was a habitable world, and humans of the Mesolithic period were present in the wider region around it. Tools, bones, submerged sediments, pollen, and mapped river systems point toward a landscape that once belonged to ordinary human life, not myth. The connection to the beginning of Britain is direct. If Britain later became an island, Doggerland was part of the reason it had once been something else. It was not only a bridge in the narrow sense of a crossing, it was a wide zone of living space between the future island and the continent. Through such a zone, people, animals, plants, techniques and habits could move gradually. A child born near a river mouth may have known paths that led westward without imagining a border between Europe and Britain. Generations could follow animals, exchange tools, meet other groups, or retreat from flooding ground long before anyone could describe these movements as migration. This is why the word continent in the title needs quiet handling. Doggerland was not a continent like Africa or Europe. But to the people whose world was measured by walking, weather and food, a large lowland could feel like an entire country of life. Its loss would not be a line erased from a map. It would be the disappearance of familiar ground, one wet place after another, until the connected world became harder to cross, and Britain began to move toward islandhood, quietly, through mud, reeds, river water, and the slow pressure of the sea. The most important question is not only how a lowland disappeared beneath the sea, but what kind of human world disappeared with it. When a land connection vanishes, the change is not limited to geography. It reaches into movement, memory, food, kinship, and the quiet ways one generation teaches the next, where life can be found. In the older landscape between Britain and the continent, a group could move through a chain of familiar places rather than face a hard division of water. A river valley might lead toward marsh, the marsh toward higher ground, the higher ground toward another drainage basin, and beyond that, toward the western lands that would later become Britain. This did not mean every journey was easy or constant. Mesolithic people were not wandering without structure. Their movements were shaped by seasons, resources, weather, children, older bodies, animals, and the need to return to places that had proved useful before. But as long as the land remained connected, the future island was part of a wider human field. People could arrive, leave, meet others, and return by routes that were difficult but possible. The disappearance of Doggerland slowly changed the grammar of those routes. A path that once crossed damp ground could become a tidal channel. A hunting area could become a shoreline. A remembered place could become unsafe, then unreachable, then invisible. The effect would not have been the same everywhere at once. Some areas may have been lost gradually through rising water. Some may have remained usable for a time as islands, banks, or higher patches. Some could have been reshaped by storms and currents. The human consequence was not a single simple tragedy, but a narrowing of options. When lowland goes underwater, groups must adjust where they sleep, where they find food, where they meet others, and how far they can travel without boats or rafts. Archaeology cannot tell us every decision made beside a flooded channel. It can only point to the larger condition. The map of possible life was changing. This is where Britain's origin as an island becomes more than a coastline story. Islandhood affects how bodies and ideas move. It can slow contact, not stop it completely. It can make sea crossing more important. It can change which animals arrive naturally and which do not. It can shape the rhythm of settlement, exchange and isolation across many generations. Later histories of Britain would involve ships, trade, invasion, migration, and cultural mixture, so it would be wrong to imagine the island as sealed away. But before all those later events, the first separation came from water rising over a prehistoric plain. The roots of that separation reach back to human beings who had no written borders, but who lived with the physical truth of distance. For them, geography was not an idea. It was the weight of walking, the cold of wet clothing, the danger of deep water, the need to carry food, the difficulty of moving children, the skill required to cross from one safe place to another. This gives the question at the centre of the story its deeper shape. A swallowed land does not only remove soil, it removes relationships between places. It changes how a child might learn the world from an elder. It changes whether a group can follow animals across a familiar route. It changes whether distant people remain reachable through ordinary travel or become separated by a widening sea. In this way, the creation of Britain was not a sudden birth, but a long loosening from the continent. Doggerland was the fading middle ground. Its loss turned connection into memory, and memory into seabed. The waves did not create Britain from nothing. They helped finish a transformation already underway, leaving behind an island whose earliest story begins not with isolation, but with a vanished passage beneath the North Sea. After the last great cold period began to loosen its hold, northwestern Europe did not wake into the world we know today. It entered a long in-between time, neither fully frozen nor stable, neither Ice Age plain nor modern coastline. Huge masses of ice that had once pressed across northern lands were shrinking. Glaciers retreated. Meltwater moved through valleys and low basins. The sea, which had been held lower while so much water was locked in ice, began to rise again. This rise was not a single flood arriving in one night. It was a slow, planetary change, driven by warming climate, melting ice sheets, shifting land, and the return of water to the oceans. For the people living then, the change would not have looked like a graph or a global event. It would have appeared as wet ground where dry ground had been remembered, as a shoreline that no longer stayed where elders expected it, as a river mouth becoming wider, saltier, and harder to cross. The beginning of Britain as an island lies inside this slow rearrangement of the earth after the last ice age. Before the sea completed that separation, the land between Britain and the continent still carried life. Doggerland existed because the old lower sea level had left wide spaces exposed. As the climate warmed, those spaces became more vulnerable every generation. Water entered from the edges, marshes expanded, tides reached farther, channels deepened. Places that had once connected one area to another became broken by pools, mudflats, and moving water. This is why the story cannot be reduced to one wave alone. The later wave matters because it may have struck a world already weakened by the sea's return. But the deeper cause was older and slower. Ice had shaped the land, then melting ice released the water that remade it. Human beings stood inside that process, not above it. Their lives began from the same needs that had carried our species through colder ages: finding food, keeping children alive, reading weather, remembering safe routes, and staying close enough to others for knowledge to pass on. In the Mesolithic world, people were not building stone cities on permanent borders. They were adapting to a landscape whose useful places could shift across a lifetime. A family might know a dry rise near a wetland, a place where animals crossed, a pool where fish gathered, or a patch of woodland where fuel and materials could be found. Such knowledge could be inherited quietly, through walking and watching. Yet when seas rise, inherited knowledge begins to meet new limits. A path still remembered by adults may become dangerous for children. A crossing used in one generation may become impossible in the next. A familiar shoreline may move so gradually that no single day feels historic, even though the long result is enormous. In this way, the post-glacial world teaches a colder truth about human origins. Our species did not begin history by controlling landscapes, but by learning how to survive within them. Doggerland was one of those landscapes. It was not a mythic kingdom under the sea. It was a low living region exposed by Ice Age conditions and then slowly reclaimed as those conditions ended. The retreat of ice also changed rivers, vegetation, animal ranges, and the timing of seasonal life. Forests spread into areas once more open. Wetlands formed where drainage slowed. Animals followed changing plants and water. People followed possibilities. The map of life was being redrawn before anyone could draw maps. When we imagine Britain before islandhood, we are looking at one moment in that redrawing. A western land still reachable across a shrinking low world, while the sea waited at the margins, patient, rising, and without memory. The question that remains is not simply when the water arrived, but how long people could continue to live as if the old connections would hold. The sea did not take Doggerland in one clean motion. It entered the low places slowly, using gravity, tide, storm, and time. A person standing near one water channel might not have seen the end of a world. They might only have seen a bank collapse after rain, or salt water reaching farther into a marsh, or a familiar crossing becoming soft underfoot. This is how large changes often arrive in human life. They do not always announce themselves as disasters. They become a little more difficult to ignore each year. In the centuries after the last ice age, the rising sea pressed into river mouths and hollow ground. It widened channels that had once been narrow. It turned fresh wetlands into brackish edges. It made some routes longer, some camps less safe, and some food sources less predictable. Doggerland was vulnerable because it was low, and because lowland lives close to water even in peaceful times. Its richness and its danger came from the same condition. Water gathered animals, fish, birds, plants, and people. Water also loosened soil, filled basins, and erased paths. For Mesolithic communities, the change would have been experienced through practical problems rather than abstract fear. Where could a group sleep without waking in damp ground? Where could dry wood be found after storms? Which old trail still led to firm land, and which one now ended in mud or tidal water? Which fishing place remained useful, and which one had changed with the salt? These questions connect directly to the human beginning of the story, because early communities survived by reading small signs in the world around them. Their knowledge was built from repeated contact with place. They learned by walking, watching, returning, and remembering. A coastline that moves slowly can disturb that entire system without destroying it all at once. The old knowledge remains, but it must be corrected. A place once safe becomes seasonal. A route once direct becomes a detour. A wetland once fresh begins to taste of the sea. Over generations, these small corrections could accumulate into a different life. Children might grow up knowing water where their grandparents had known open ground. Elders might remember animals moving across areas that were now broken by channels. No single memory would need to describe the whole transformation. The landscape itself would carry the change. This is why the story of Doggerland should not be imagined as one sudden punishment from the ocean. Long before the Storegga tsunami, the sea had already been entering the world beneath the future North Sea. The wave may have been dramatic, but it came into a landscape already being reduced. The quieter force was the long rise of post-glacial water. It did not need speed to be powerful. It only needed to continue. As water advanced, Britain's connection to the continent became less like a broad shared land and more like a set of narrowing possibilities. Movement may still have continued. People were capable of adapting, and water itself was not only a barrier, it could be a route for skilled communities using simple craft, though the evidence does not allow us to describe every crossing. But distance was changing its meaning. A journey that once belonged to walking began to require different knowledge, different risks, and perhaps different timing. This matters because islandhood is not only a fact of geology, it is a fact that enters the body. It changes how far people can carry food, how safely children can travel, how often groups can meet, and how knowledge moves between them. The sea's slow arrival turned a connected landscape into a broken one, not by hatred, not by intention, but by the ordinary behaviour of a warming planet. Doggerland faded because the conditions that had exposed it were ending. Ice had once held water away. Melting returned that water to the oceans. The low country received the result. Beneath the calm surface of today's North Sea, that history remains written in buried riverbeds and drowned sediments. It reminds us that before Britain became separate, separation was prepared one shoreline at a time. For Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, the changing world after the Ice Age was not an event watched from a distance. It was the ground of daily life. They lived in a Europe where forests were spreading, animals were adjusting their ranges, rivers were changing their courses, and the sea was slowly returning to lands that had been dry for many generations. Their lives depended on movement, but not movement without meaning. They likely followed seasonal patterns shaped by food, weather, shelter, and the needs of small communities. A group might spend time near rivers when fish were plentiful, move toward woodland when certain plants, animals, or materials were useful, and return to known places when conditions allowed. In such a world, knowledge was not stored in writing. It was carried in bodies and memory: how to shape a stone edge, where to find dry ground, when birds arrived, how water behaved after storms, where children could walk safely, and which paths led toward other people. This kind of knowledge tied human life directly to place. When the place changed, the knowledge had to change with it. Doggerland, sitting low between the future Britain and the continent, would have made that lesson unavoidable. Rising seas did not only cover land, they rearranged the habits that made life possible. A family or small band did not need to understand global sea level to feel the consequences of a flooded route. The body understood first. Feet met mud where there had been firm soil. Hands had to carry food farther. Eyes had to read tides and channels more carefully. Older people may have known places that younger people could no longer use in the same way, though we cannot know their words or private feelings. What can be said with care is that environmental change creates pressure across generations. It asks each generation to inherit the past, without being able to live in it exactly. That is one of the quiet human truths at the heart of Doggerland. The people there were not passive victims of nature, and they were not modern planners with scientific maps. They were skilled human beings living by attention. Their tools, camps, fires and journeys belonged to a world where survival came from adapting to local conditions. But adaptation has limits. If a hunting ground becomes tidal, if a wetland grows too unstable, if a crossing becomes deep water, then a group must shift. Some may move west toward the higher lands that would become Britain. Some may move east or south toward the continent. Some may remain near the changing coast for as long as it offers food. These are cautious possibilities, not certain stories. The evidence does not allow us to follow one named group across one named year. It allows us to see the larger pattern. As the sea advanced, the human map narrowed and changed. This connects Doggerland to the deeper history of our species. Humans began as animals of landscape, bodies shaped by walking, hunger, cooperation, fear, learning, and memory. Long before agriculture, long before permanent towns, long before written borders, people survived by forming relationships with places that could feed and shelter them. The loss of land, therefore, meant more than the loss of scenery. It meant the loss of learned relationships. A riverbank was not just a riverbank. It could be a route, a fishing place, a marker, a meeting point, a place where stone or wood could be worked, a place remembered because it had once kept a group alive. When such places disappeared underwater, the world did not become empty, but it became different. Britain's later island story began in this difference. The future island was not cut off from human life. It remained occupied and connected by other means. But the old broad connection through Doggerland was becoming harder to sustain. Distance grew not only in miles, but in risk. Contact between groups may still have happened, yet it required new choices around water. The sea was changing the scale of life. A child born into a more flooded landscape would learn a different geography from the one known by earlier generations. Over time, this is how a continent edge becomes an island edge. Not through one decision, not through one moment of panic, but through repeated adjustments made by human bodies in a world where the ground itself was withdrawing. The slow rise of the sea prepared the stage on which one later wave would become so meaningful, because by then Doggerland was already a fragile remainder of a much larger human world. To imagine Doggerland as a homeland, it helps to begin not with the sea that covers it now, but with the water that once ran through it. Rivers likely crossed the low plain in branching lines, gathering rain and streams before moving towards shallow basins and coasts that no longer exist above the surface. Around those rivers there would have been wet ground, reed beds, pools, and firmer soil where trees could take root. The landscape was not one simple field. It was a mosaic, and mosaics matter to human survival. A place where dry ground meets marsh, where woodland meets open space, where fresh water approaches salt water, often holds life close together. For Mesolithic people, such edges could be useful. Fish might gather in channels, birds might feed in wetlands, deer and other animals might come to drink. Plants could provide food, fibers, fuel, or materials. Wood could be shaped, bone and antler could be worked, stones suitable for tools could be collected. The human body in this world was always negotiating with texture. Soft mud, cold water, dry ridges, wind, mist, forest shade, and open spaces where animals could be seen. This was not wilderness in the empty sense. It was a lived environment known through repeated movement. People did not need permanent buildings to belong to it. Belonging could be made by returning, by recognizing a bend in a stream, by knowing when ground would hold weight, by remembering where fuel remained dry, by passing knowledge through gesture, habit, and attention. The origin of Britain as an island is hidden inside this older landscape of contact. Before water made separation, Doggerland offered continuity. It allowed the future eastern shore of Britain to face not an open sea, but a wide, low country of rivers and wetlands. That country could support animals moving between regions and people moving with them. We should be careful not to overfill the scene. There is no honest way to describe every camp, shelter, or conversation. The evidence is scattered, often recovered from seabed materials, sediment cores, and underwater mapping. Yet the environmental picture is strong enough to show that Doggerland was not a blank. Pollen can suggest past vegetation. Animal remains can show which species lived in the wider region. Submerged landforms reveal buried river channels and old surfaces. Together, they point toward a lowland where life gathered because water and land were interwoven. Such a place would have shaped how people moved through the year. In warmer months, wetland edges might have drawn fish, birds, and plants. In colder or wetter times, higher ground and woodland margins could have mattered more. Some locations may have been used briefly, others repeatedly, and many may now be lost beyond recovery. The point is not to turn Doggerland into a fantasy country with invented details. The point is to see it as a real ecological space where humans could solve the basic problems of life. They needed calories, warmth, sleep, tools, bonds, and routes that made sense. Doggerland offered possibilities for those needs because it was varied. But that same low, watery richness also carried the seed of its disappearance. The rivers, marshes, and shallow basins that made the land alive also made it open to flooding as the sea rose. A homeland built from edges can become vulnerable when the edge itself begins to move. Long before the final drowning, people in this region may have lived with a landscape that rewarded attention and punished carelessness. A safe path could depend on season. A useful place could depend on weather. A wetland could feed a group, then block its return. This is why Doggerland matters to the human story. It reminds us that early history was not only made on dry ground. It was made where water, mud, animals, plants, and human memory met, until the sea changed the meaning of home. The animals of Doggerland were not background creatures in a human story. They were part of the structure of life itself. In a low country of rivers, marshes, woodland, and open ground, animal movement would have shaped where people went, when they waited, and how they understood the seasons. Some of the species known from the broader post-glacial environment of northwestern Europe included red deer, roe deer, wild boar, aurochs, and smaller mammals. In wetter areas, fish, water birds, and animals drawn to river edges would have mattered as well. It is safer to speak in terms of ecological likelihood and regional evidence, rather than to pretend we can place every animal on one exact bank at one exact hour. But the larger picture is clear enough. Doggerland was not only land between lands, it was a feeding place, a crossing place, and a living corridor for many forms of life. For human beings, animals were food, material, danger, and knowledge. A deer was not simply meat. It was hide, sinew, bone, antler, movement, timing, and sign. A wild boar was not only a possible meal, it was a powerful body in the undergrowth, able to injure, able to vanish, able to teach caution. Fish were not only food taken from water. They required attention to flow, season, depth, and method. Birds at wetlands could reveal the health of a marsh, the presence of open water, and the rhythm of the year. In this sense, the human beginning of Britain's island story was not separate from animal life. Before the sea divided the future island from the continent, humans and animals moved through a shared landscape of roots and resources. The future boundary of Britain did not yet exist for them. What mattered was whether the ground could be crossed, whether water could be used, whether food could be found, and whether a group could remain alive through changing weather. The richness of Doggerland came partly from its edges. Where river met marsh, where woodland thinned into open ground, where dry ridges rose near wet basins, different animals could gather in nearby zones. Such places can be especially valuable to hunter-gatherers because they bring several kinds of possibility close together. A group might find fish in one area, mammals near another, birds in the reeds, and plant materials along the margins. This does not mean life was easy. Rich landscapes can also be difficult landscapes. Wet ground slows walking. Cold water drains strength from the body. Mist can reduce sight. Insects, storms, unstable banks, and deep channels can turn a useful place into a dangerous one. Human skill lay in reading these conditions, not in escaping them. Tools made from stone, bone, antler, and wood were part of that reading. So were tracks, broken reeds, dung, calls, feathers, and repeated memory of where animals had been found before. The people of this world did not need written maps because the body itself carried maps of attention. Feet learned firm ground. Hands learned useful materials. Eyes learned movement at the edge of trees. Ears learned the difference between wind, water, and animal presence. Over generations, such knowledge could become as important as any object left behind for archaeologists to find. Yet when the environment changed, animal patterns also changed. Rising water could shift grazing areas, drown low paths, alter vegetation, and make some crossings disappear. If animals no longer moved through the same places, people had to adjust as well. A hunting route might lose its value. A wetland might become more productive for fish but less useful for travel. A wooded rise might become more important because the surrounding lower ground had grown wetter. These changes connect directly to the slow creation of Britain. As Doggerland shrank, it did not only remove human walking routes, it altered the living networks that joined humans with animals, plants, water, and season. The future island became increasingly distinct because the shared lowland between it and Europe was breaking apart. Some animals would no longer move as freely, some human contacts would become harder, some old combinations of resources would disappear beneath tidal water. We should not imagine this as a single moment when every creature fled and every person understood the end. The evidence does not support that kind of simple drama. The more truthful image is quieter. A marsh changes. A herd chooses another path. A fishing place improves for a while, then becomes too exposed. A familiar bank collapses. A dry rise becomes surrounded more often by water. People continue to live because humans are adaptable, but they live inside a pattern that is losing its old shape. Doggerland as a homeland was therefore not only soil, it was a web of animal movement and human response. When that web was cut by the sea, Britain's separation became biological as well as geographical. The people who lived in and around Doggerland should not be imagined as unfinished versions of ourselves. They were human beings with the same basic bodies, the same need for sleep, food, warmth, social closeness, and learned skill. What made their lives different was not a smaller humanity, but a different relationship with the land. They lived before farming had reshaped this region, before permanent villages became common in Britain, before written records, before the sea had finished separating the western lands from the continent. Their world required attention to movement. A good place was not only a place to stay, it was a place within a chain of other places. Water, shelter, fuel, stone, animals, plants, higher ground and routes toward other people. In such a life, intelligence was practical and local. It lived in the way a person selected stone for a blade, carried fire or remade it, watched animal signs, repaired tools, read weather, and understood which ground could be trusted after rain. Doggerland, with its rivers, marshes, woodland edges, and open spaces, would have rewarded that kind of knowledge. It was not a simple, empty bridge between Europe and Britain. It was a landscape that could be used, crossed, remembered, and returned to. To call these people hunter-gatherers is accurate, but the phrase can sound too small if we hear it only as a label. Hunting and gathering were not casual acts. They required a lifetime of learning. A plant could be useful in one season and useless in another. A river could be generous at one time and dangerous at another. An animal trail could reveal food, but also risk. Children had to learn not only what to eat, but where to step, when to wait, when to follow adults, and how to recognize the ordinary signs of safety. Older people, if they survived into later life, may have held knowledge of places that younger bodies had not yet fully understood. We cannot put words into their mouths, and we should not invent their beliefs, but we can recognize the human structure of learning across generations. This is one reason the loss of Doggerland matters. When a living landscape disappears, the loss is not only measured in square miles, it is measured in broken chains of knowledge. A place where fish were once taken, where animals crossed, where dry wood could be found, where one group might meet another, could vanish beneath water and take its usefulness with it. The people of Doggerland were therefore not living outside history. They were part of the deep history of adaptation that began long before any written kingdom. Human beings had already passed through cold ages, warm intervals, shifting climates, and unfamiliar environments. Our species survived because bodies and minds could work together in groups, because memory could be shared, because children could be taught, because hands could make tools, and because people could adjust when the world changed. Doggerland shows that ability clearly, but it also shows its limits. Adaptation is not control. A group can move camp, alter a route, seek new food, or learn a changed shoreline, but it cannot hold back a rising sea by memory alone. This is where the future island of Britain begins to take shape in human terms. As Doggerland became wetter and smaller, the people who used it would have faced more decisions about where to go and how to remain connected. Some routes westward may have become harder. Some routes eastward may have become more important. Some groups may have spent more time near coasts, others farther inland. These are possibilities, not certain biographies. The evidence does not allow us to follow one family from one camp to another. It allows us to understand the pressure of the changing world around them. The sea was not simply covering land. It was changing the balance between walking and crossing, between return and departure, between familiar routes and uncertain water. The later creation of Britain as an island was therefore not just a geological fact, it was also a human process, because every new channel, every drowned path, every flooded low place entered the daily calculations of living bodies. In this quiet way, Doggerland asks us to see prehistoric people with dignity. They were not characters in a disaster story waiting for the ocean to arrive. They were skilled communities living in a rich but vulnerable place, making use of what the land offered while the conditions beneath that land slowly changed. Their world had no written borders, but it had structure. It had paths, seasons, tools, habits, risks, and memories. When the sea finally took the low country, it did not erase a blank space. It covered a human environment where people had once learned how to belong. Doggerland is difficult to study because the place itself is no longer available in the ordinary way archaeology often depends on. There is no broad open field where researchers can walk slowly, mark out a square, and peel back soil with brushes and patience. Much of the old landscape lies beneath the North Sea, covered by water, sediment, currents, fishing activity, storms, and the long disturbance of a marine environment. The ground that once held rivers, marshes, animal tracks, and human movement is now hidden under a surface that changes with wind and tide. This does not make Doggerland unknowable, but it does make it hard to approach. A stone tool found on a beach or lifted in a fishing net can tell us that human life touched the drowned world, yet it cannot immediately reveal the exact camp, the exact season, or the exact route by which someone moved across that place. A bone dredged from the seabed can speak of animals that once lived in the region, but the sea has often moved objects away from their original setting. In ordinary land archaeology, context is precious. Where an object lies, what layer holds it, what sits above and below it, and what other traces surround it can be as meaningful as the object itself. Under the North Sea, that context is often damaged, buried, scattered, or difficult to reach. This is why the study of Doggerland has to be patient. It is built from fragments, from patterns, and from careful restraint. Researchers do not simply dive down and find a preserved country waiting like a sleeping village. They reconstruct a lost landscape through seabed mapping, sediment cores, old river channels, pollen, animal remains, and occasional human-made objects. Each type of evidence gives a different kind of truth. A buried channel may show where water once flowed. Pollen can suggest what plants grew in a place or nearby. Sediments can show whether an area was river, lake, marsh, shore, or open water across time. Animal remains can point toward the creatures that lived in the wider environment. Stone tools can remind us that human hands were present. Yet none of these traces should be forced to say more than they can. We can say Doggerland was a real lowland landscape between Britain and the continent. We can say it was gradually drowned as seas rose after the last ice age. We can say Mesolithic people lived in the wider world around it, and almost certainly used such rich environments where land and water met. But we should not invent named settlements, detailed scenes of panic, or private memories for people who left no written voice. The silence is not a failure. It is one of the conditions of truth. To listen to Doggerland honestly, we must accept that its evidence comes to us unevenly. The beginning of Britain's island story is therefore not held in one clear ruin. It is held in a submerged archive, where the pages are muddy, torn, and scattered across the seabed. This makes the story quieter, but also deeper. It asks us to think about human origins not as a neat line of events, but as a relationship between bodies and landscapes that can vanish before anyone writes them down. A person living near an ancient Doggerland river did not need to leave a monument to be real. A small tool, a cut mark on bone, a trace of old vegetation, or the shape of a drowned valley may be enough to show that life once moved there. The difficulty is that the sea does not preserve meaning in the way a library does. It preserves pieces. It covers some things, destroys others, and separates objects from the ground that once explained them. For this reason, every confident statement about Doggerland must be balanced by care. The lost land was not imaginary, but neither is it fully visible. It sits between knowledge and absence. That is why it matters so much to the question of how Britain was created. The island did not emerge from a story written clearly on dry land. It emerged from the slow loss of a landscape that can now be studied only through the hidden shapes beneath water. Before Britain became a place surrounded by sea, the evidence for that older connection had already begun to sink into the very element that would make the separation complete. The evidence for Doggerland does not come from one perfect discovery. It comes from many kinds of traces, each modest on its own, but meaningful when placed together. Some traces are objects shaped by human hands, such as stone tools recovered from the seabed, from beaches, or from material brought up by fishing and dredging. A worked flint can be small enough to rest in a palm, yet it carries a large message. It says that someone selected stone, struck it with skill, and made an edge for cutting or scraping. It does not tell us that person's name. It does not tell us what they thought when they looked across a marsh or followed a river, but it confirms presence, skill, and use. Other traces come from animal bones, antler, and remains carried from drowned deposits. These can show the kinds of animals that lived in the wider region and the environments that could support them. When such evidence is found with signs of human working, it may help connect animals not only to landscape, but to human activity. Still, the sea complicates everything. Objects can move, currents can scatter them, dredging can remove them from the layer that once explained them. This is why a single object is rarely enough to rebuild a whole world. The stronger picture comes from combining evidence. Sediment cores are especially important because they allow researchers to read the seabed vertically, like a quiet record of change. A core can contain layers of sand, mud, peat, shells, organic matter, and other materials that formed under different conditions. One layer may suggest a river environment, another may point to marsh, lake, shoreline, or open marine water. Within such layers, pollen can survive. Pollen is small, but it can speak calmly about vanished vegetation. It may suggest whether an area once held grasses, shrubs, trees, or wetland plants. From this, a drowned surface becomes more than a flat idea. It becomes a changing habitat. The same is true of mapped landforms beneath the sea. Modern surveys can reveal buried river channels, old valleys, ridges, basins, and surfaces now hidden below water and sediment. These shapes matter because humans and animals do not move across abstract space. They move along real ground. A river valley can guide travel. A ridge can offer dryness. A basin can hold water and food. A shoreline can draw fish, birds, plants, and people close together. When these features are mapped, Doggerland begins to appear not as a legend, but as a real landscape with structure. The origin of Britain's islandhood becomes easier to understand. A connected land did not simply vanish from a blank sea. It was transformed from a network of river systems, wetlands, and dry patches into a drowned terrain, and then into the seabed we know today. Yet the same evidence that gives shape to Doggerland also teaches caution. A map of buried channels is not a map of human footsteps. Pollen tells us about plants, not about private memories. A stone tool tells us about human skill, not about a complete life story. Animal remains tell us about ecological possibility, not every hunt or every meal. Honest history must hold these limits. This is especially important for a story with a powerful title. The phrase of a wave swallowing a land can help us feel the scale of loss, but the evidence shows a longer process. Sea level rise after the Ice Age, a shrinking lowland, changing habitats, and then, perhaps, a major tsunami striking what remained. The traces under the North Sea do not support careless certainty. They support a slower truth. Doggerland was real. It carried animals, plants, waters, roots, and human use within a wider Mesolithic world. To study it now is to rebuild a vanished environment from mud, stone, bone, pollen, and buried channels, remembering that the deepest story is not what we invent, but what the surviving traces allow us to say. The most honest way to approach Doggerland is to let the evidence stay incomplete. This may feel unsatisfying, because a drowned homeland invites the mind to fill the empty spaces. It is easy to imagine fires beside rivers, families watching the tide, voices warning children away from deep mud, or people remembering ground that no longer existed. Some of those images may be humanly plausible, but plausibility is not the same as evidence. The seabed does not give us permission to invent a full society where the traces are thin. What it gives us is quieter and more demanding. Tools, bones, sediments, pollen, buried channels, and the broad outline of a changing world. From these traces we can speak with care. We can say that a lowland once lay between the future Britain and the European continent. We can say that it held rivers, wetlands, dry ground, plants, animals, and places suitable for human use. We can say that people of the Mesolithic world lived in the wider region and almost certainly made use of such rich environments. We can say that sea level rise gradually reduced the land and that a great tsunami from the Storegga slide may have struck what remained. But beyond that, the line between knowledge and invention must be watched closely. We do not know the names of groups who moved there. We do not know what they called the rivers. We do not know whether one flooded place was remembered in story, song, warning, silence, or not at all. We do not know if a specific family fled a specific wave. To pretend otherwise would make the story more dramatic, but less true. And for a story about human beginnings, truth matters more than decoration. The people who lived near Doggerland were not symbols placed there for our imagination. They were real human beings whose lives deserve careful treatment precisely because they cannot answer us. Their world was not primitive emptiness, and it was not a lost kingdom with clear borders and hidden cities. It was a human landscape before writing, before nations, before the island identity of Britain had taken form. That means the absence of detail is not a weakness to be covered over. It is itself a lesson. Much of human history happened without leaving words. Much of it happened in camps that vanished, on shorelines that moved, beside fires whose ash is gone, along paths now underwater. The beginning of Britain as an island belongs to that deep, fragile record. It is built from changes in earth, water, climate, and human adaptation, not from a single eyewitness account. This is why Doggerland should be described with both imagination and restraint. Imagination helps us understand that these were lived places, not empty diagrams. Restraint keeps us from turning uncertainty into false memory. The sea swallowed evidence as well as land. It covered possible camps, disturbed objects, buried surfaces, and separated many traces from the contexts that once made them clearer. What remains must be handled like a dim light in a dark room. It can reveal shape, but not everything. It can show that a river once ran there, that trees once grew there, that animals moved through the region, that human hands shaped tools, and that water eventually changed the whole geography. It cannot give us every fear, hope, route, meal, or farewell. In that limit, Doggerland becomes more meaningful, not less. It reminds us that the creation of Britain was not only an event in geology, it was also the fading of a human environment almost entirely beyond direct memory. The most truthful conclusion for now is not a closed answer, but a careful boundary. A real land disappeared, real people lived in and around its world, and the sea left us enough to know the loss was profound, but not enough to pretend we have heard every voice beneath the North Sea. A land can disappear long before the last dry ground is gone. It begins with the edges. A pool grows wider after seasons of rain and tide. A river mouth becomes harder to cross. A patch of firm soil that once joined two familiar roots begins to flood more often. For people living in Doggerland, the loss of the low country was probably not felt as one clean ending. It would have been stretched across generations, carried in small changes that only became enormous when seen from far away. A child might learn a shoreline as normal, while an older person remembered that same place as inland ground. Another generation might know the old route only as a story attached to a marsh, a channel, or a dangerous crossing. This is how rising seas can change human life without needing to announce themselves. They make the old world slightly less usable, then less reliable, then finally unreachable. Doggerland was especially exposed to this kind of slow reduction because much of it was low and watery. Such landscapes can feed people well, but they do not resist the sea easily. As post-glacial water rose, the coastline would not have advanced like a straight line on a map. It would have entered hollows, followed river valleys, filled basins, widened channels, and left patches of higher ground standing for a time like islands within a shrinking plain. To human beings, that meant the map of daily survival changed unevenly. Some places may have remained valuable for fishing or birding even after they became wetter. Some dry routes may have lasted for many years, then failed. Some camps may have shifted by only a short distance, while other areas became too exposed, too damp, or too cut off. The human response would also have been uneven. People are not helpless when environments change. They move, adjust, remember, experiment, and teach. A group could choose a higher camp, follow animals into different ground, spend more time near a new shore, or seek contact with people in safer areas. But adjustment does not mean nothing is lost. A route used by many generations can carry more than practical value. It can connect feeding places, meeting places, shelters, and memories of successful returns. When the sea breaks that route, it changes the shape of belonging. This reaches back to the beginning of human history, because our species survived by joining memory to movement. Before written records, a landscape was known through repeated experience. The body remembered distance, slope, mud, cold, wind, and shelter. The mind remembered where others had gone before. Children learn not from maps, but by following feet across real ground. If that ground slowly withdrew, each generation had to inherit a world slightly different from the one described by its elders. This does not mean every family faced constant disaster. More likely, life continued through many ordinary seasons. Tools were made, Food was gathered, fires were kept, children slept, people watched water, animals, and weather as they always had. Yet beneath that ordinary rhythm, the lowland was contracting. The future Britain was becoming less open to the continent through shared ground. Distance was becoming more watery. Old routes were turning into decisions that required more caution, more timing, and perhaps different skills. The creation of Britain as an island therefore began not as a single border drawn by the sea, but as a slow thinning of connections. Doggerland was reduced piece by piece, and with each reduction the human world around it had to bend. What later appears on a map as separation may have first been felt as inconvenience, then danger, then absence. By the time one great wave entered this story, the old low country had already been made fragile by centuries of water. The final shock mattered, because the slow loss had prepared the ground for it over many human lifetimes. When a landscape shrinks, the first losses may be practical. A route takes longer, a crossing becomes unsafe after rain. A place where animals once gathered no longer gives enough food at the right season. A camp that had been useful because it stood near water becomes too wet, too exposed, or too close to a changing shore. These are not small things for people whose lives depend on attention to place. In Doggerland, the rising sea would have changed not only the outline of land, but the rhythm of daily movement. A group that once moved across a broad lowland could have found itself forced to travel along narrower corridors, avoid deeper channels, or wait for tides and weather. The body feels such changes before history names them. Feet carry heavier distances, children slower journey, older people may need safer ground. Food gathered in one place must be carried farther to another. Dry shelter becomes more important as wetlands expand. The whole pattern of living can shift without any single moment looking like the end of a world. This is how the disappearance of Doggerland likely entered human life, through repeated adjustments that slowly became a different existence. Food would have been one of the clearest pressures. A wetland can be generous. It can offer fish, birds, plants, reeds, and animals drawn to water. But when fresh water becomes more brackish, when shorelines move, some foods may become easier to find for a time. Others may disappear from familiar places. A fishing location might improve as water deepens, then later become too exposed or too dangerous. A place where mammals crossed firm ground might become broken by mud and tidal pools. A grove that provided fuel, shade, or tool material might become isolated, drowned, or harder to reach. People could adapt, but adaptation required new knowledge. The old pattern could not simply be repeated. This matters because early human communities lived through knowledge shared across generations. A child did not learn the world as an abstract environment. A child learned it as a chain of useful places, where water was safe, where food could be found, where the ground held weight, where people had met others before, where the group could sleep without fear of flooding. If the land changed faster than the teaching could remain reliable, then each generation had to correct what it had inherited. The memory of a path might still exist, but the path itself might no longer serve the body. Social life would have been affected as well. In a connected landscape, small groups could encounter one another through seasonal movement, shared resource zones, and overlapping routes. These meetings may have mattered for exchange, partnership, news, learning, and the long health of populations. We should not invent ceremonies, alliances, or exact relationships that the evidence does not show. But from what is broadly known about small human groups, isolation and contact both matter. People need more than calories. They need other people, and not only those immediately beside them. As Doggerland narrowed, the ease of contact between the future Britain and the continent may have changed. A meeting that once required walking across low ground might later require crossing water or taking a longer route around broken terrain. That change could affect who met whom, how often, and under what risks. Britain was not suddenly sealed away, but its relationship with the continent was becoming less ordinary. The sea was turning distance into a more serious fact. For human bodies, this could mean fewer simple returns and more careful choices. For generations, it could mean a gradual redrawing of belonging. The old lowland had linked places through movement. As it faded, some people may have moved toward higher ground, some toward remaining coasts, some toward areas that still held familiar resources. These movements should be treated as possibilities, Not as a single dramatic migration. The evidence is not detailed enough for that. What it does support is the larger pattern. Environmental change can reshape population structure without leaving a written account. Groups may split, routes may close. Contacts may thin in one direction and strengthen in another. Children may grow up with a smaller world of land travel than their grandparents knew. Over many lifetimes, this is how geography enters ancestry. Not as a legend of one wave alone, but as pressure on food, safety, travel, and connection. Doggerland's shrinking changed the human map before it fully vanished. By reducing the places where people could sleep, eat, cross, meet, and return, it helped turn the future Britain from a reachable western land into a more separate island world. A shrinking land does not only change where people walk, it can change who remains close enough to know one another. In a world of small Mesolithic groups, contact mattered. It could allow people to find partners, exchange materials, share knowledge, learn about distant conditions, and maintain ties beyond the immediate camp. We should not imagine a large, organised population spread across Doggerland like a later nation. The evidence does not support that. It is safer to picture small communities moving through useful places, sometimes meeting others, sometimes separating, always shaped by food, weather, season, and risk. When the land between Britain and the continent narrowed, those patterns of contact would have been placed under pressure. A route that once allowed two groups to meet by walking through wetlands and river valleys might become harder as channels widened. A known meeting place might become too wet, too exposed, or too far from safe ground. Some groups may have shifted westward, toward the rising lands of what would become Britain. Others may have moved eastward or southward toward the continent. Some may have remained near the changing coast for generations because the new shore still offered fish, birds, shellfish, wood, and other resources. These are not certain journeys. They are cautious possibilities drawn from the logic of a changing environment. What matters is the broader human pattern. As Doggerland became smaller, the social map also changed. People who once belonged to a wider field of movement may have found their choices becoming more local or more dependent on water crossing. For the human body, this was not an abstract demographic shift. It was felt through the difficulty of carrying children across wet ground, the need to move elders safely, the risk of losing food during longer journeys, and the problem of finding reliable shelter in a place where the edges kept moving. Population history begins in such ordinary pressures. It begins before names, before records, before anyone can say that an island has been born. A few families changing direction can become, over many generations, a new pattern of ancestry. A closed route can reduce contact. A new shore can draw people together. A dangerous crossing can make old relationships less frequent. No single decision needs to look historic at the time, yet the accumulated result can alter the future. This is one reason Doggerland matters so deeply. It was not only a land bridge in a simple geographic sense. It was a zone where human groups, animals, plants, and seasonal routes could overlap. As that zone broke apart, the future Britain became more distinct, not because people stopped moving entirely, but because movement had to follow different rules. Water can connect skilled people, but it also demands craft, timing, courage, and knowledge. Walking across low ground and crossing open water are not the same kind of act. The change between them can reshape a community's sense of distance. Over time, some contacts may have weakened, while others formed along new coasts. Some knowledge tied to inland wetlands may have lost value, while knowledge of shorelines, tides, and marine resources became more important. In this slow transformation, the creation of Britain was written into generations of bodies learning a new map. The old people may have known routes that younger people would never use in the same way. The young may have grown up treating water as normal where earlier lives had known land. This is not a story of sudden disappearance alone. It is a story of adjustment, narrowing, and reorientation. Doggerland's final loss would have been dramatic in the imagination, especially when linked to a great wave, but the deeper change was already moving through human groups. By the time the last low places became difficult or impossible to inhabit, Britain's separation had already begun in the quiet mathematics of distance, contact, food, and generations. Far to the north of Doggerland, beyond the low plains and drowned river valleys, the seafloor itself once failed. Off the coast of Norway, a vast underwater landslide, known today as the Storegga slide, sent enormous amounts of sediment down the continental slope. It was not a storm in the ordinary sense. It was not a wave born from wind moving across the surface. It began below the sea, where mud, sand and older deposits gave way and rushed into deeper water. When such a mass moves suddenly, it can displace water above it, and the ocean can answer by sending waves outward. Around 8,200 years ago, this process produced a tsunami that reached parts of the North Atlantic and the surrounding coasts. Its traces have been identified in deposits in places such as Scotland, Norway, and other areas around the North Sea region. For the story of Britain, this northern event matters because it may have arrived at a time when Doggerland was already greatly reduced, low, wet and vulnerable. The wave did not come into a wide ice age plain at its strongest point. It came into a world already altered by long sea level rise, a world where the old land between Britain and Europe had been thinned by water over many generations. This distinction is important. The Storegga tsunami was not the whole cause of Britain becoming an island. The island was being made slowly by the return of the sea after the last ice age, but a major wave striking a fragile lowland could still have changed lives, damaged remaining coasts, and helped mark the end of places already close to drowning. To understand this without exaggeration, we need to picture the force carefully. A tsunami in deep water may not look like a towering wall far from shore. Its danger grows as it enters shallower areas, slows, rises, and pushes inland. In a low landscape of marshes, channels, tidal flats, and remaining dry ridges, even a powerful surge of water could travel far enough to disturb soil, carry debris, flood camps, and make familiar ground unsafe. The people who lived around the North Sea world would not have known the cause beneath the Norwegian seafloor. They would have known only what reached them: unusual water, sudden force, noise, movement, flooding, and aftermath. We cannot place one family on one bank and describe what they saw. That would be invention. But we can say that human bodies in such a place were exposed to the consequences of distant geology. This is one of the cold truths of deep history. A community may understand its rivers, seasons, animal paths, and weather, yet still be vulnerable to an event whose origin lies far beyond sight. The Storegga slide connects Doggerland to forces larger than any local memory. It shows that the creation of Britain was shaped not only by slow warming and rising seas, but also by the instability of the earth itself. Underwater slopes can collapse, sediments can move, oceans can carry energy across great distances. A homeland can be struck by a wave born from a place its people may never have seen. For Mesolithic communities, the result would have entered the same practical world as all other change: where to sleep, where to walk, where to find food, and which places could still be trusted. If Doggerland still held habitable patches, the tsunami may have made some of them less usable, or erased evidence we might otherwise have found. The exact human consequences remain uncertain, and they should remain uncertain unless the evidence grows clearer. Yet the event stands as a powerful turning point in the story, because it came when the low country was already near the edge. The sea had been rising patiently for centuries. Then, from the north, the seabed moved, and the water answered. It was not the beginning, but it may have been a final blow. A tsunami begins as geology, not as intention. Nothing in the Storegga event requires mystery beyond the ordinary power of the earth. Along the continental margin west of Norway, thick layers of sediment had built up over long periods of time. Rivers, glaciers, currents, and the movement of ice had all helped deliver material toward the edge of the seabed. Under certain conditions, such deposits can become unstable. Slope, pressure, water within the sediment, and changes left behind by glacial and post-glacial conditions may all play a role. When the balance fails, the seabed can move with a force that no human hand could stop. A great mass of sediment slides downward into deeper water, and the water above it is displaced. From that displacement, waves travel outward. This is the quiet beginning of a disaster. Not thunder in the sky, not punishment, not a warning written into the air, but mud and sand, losing their hold far below the surface. For the people living around the North Sea world, the cause would have been invisible. They could know rivers, tides, wind, animal signs, and the ordinary behavior of local water. They could learn where marsh ground was weak and where channels deepened. But a collapse far under the northern sea belonged to a scale beyond direct human reading. That is why Storegga matters so deeply. It reminds us that early human communities lived close to the land, but not in command of all the forces that shaped it. Their knowledge was real, skilled, and practical. Still, the earth could move outside the circle of that knowledge. The wave that followed was not magic. It was physics moving through water. In deep water, tsunami energy can cross great distances. Near shallower coasts, the same energy can rise, slow, and push inland. The exact height and impact would have varied by coastline, seabed shape, distance, and local geography. A steep rocky shore and a low marshland do not receive water in the same way. Doggerland, by its nature, was vulnerable because it was low and already broken by channels, wetlands, and encroaching sea. A surge entering such a place could follow hollows, fill basins, overtop banks, and carry sediment across surfaces that had been dry or only seasonally wet. This does not mean every remaining part of Doggerland was instantly destroyed in one identical moment. The real world is less simple than that. Some areas may have been struck harder than others. Some places may already have been abandoned or only used seasonally. Some higher patches may have survived for a time. What can be said carefully is that a powerful tsunami reaching a shrinking lowland would have added sudden violence to a long process of drowning. That combination is important. Slow loss first, sudden force later. It is easy to tell the story as if the wave alone created Britain, but the truth is more patient. Britain was being separated by rising seas long before Storegga. The wave may have made that separation harsher, more visible, and more final in certain places. For human bodies, even one sudden flooding could change trust. A camp used before might feel unsafe after water had crossed it with unusual force. A route through low ground might be blocked by debris, new channels, or fear of return. Food stores, tools, shelters, and familiar markers could be scattered or buried. We cannot describe individual losses without inventing them, but we can understand the kinds of practical damage such an event can cause. In a world without permanent walls, written warnings, or stored surplus on a later agricultural scale, the safety of place mattered intensely. A tsunami could turn useful ground into uncertain ground. It could erase not only paths, but confidence. And yet the wave must still be placed inside the wider history of Doggerland. It was not a supernatural ending. It was one geological event striking a landscape already transformed by climate. The sea had been rising because ice had melted. The low country had been shrinking because the conditions that once exposed it were passing away. Storegga entered this story like a sudden sentence in a book that had already been written for many pages. Its power was real. Its meaning comes from timing. It reached a world whose margins had grown thin, where human roots, animal paths, and wetland habitats were already being rearranged. The seabed failed in the north, and far away the remaining lowlands felt the consequence. In that moment, the creation of Britain was not completed by a decision or a border, but by water moving through a vulnerable landscape, following the shape of the ground until old connections became harder to imagine. By the time the wave from Storegga entered the North Sea world, Doggerland was no longer the wide, confident plain that had existed when sea levels were much lower. It had already been reduced by centuries of rising water. The old lowland had become more fragmented, more coastal, more broken by channels, marshes, tidal areas, and remaining patches of higher ground. This matters because vulnerability is not only about the size of a wave, it is also about the condition of the place that receives it. A high, rocky coast can resist water differently from a flat wetland. A broad, dry plain can absorb disturbance differently from a low country already full of basins and channels. Doggerland's richness had always come from its closeness to water, but by this late stage that closeness had become dangerous. The same hollows that once held streams and wetlands could guide a sudden surge inland. The same channels that once helped fish, birds, animals and people move through the landscape could carry salt water farther than ordinary tides. The same soft sediments that preserved signs of older environments could be disturbed, shifted, or buried by unusual force. For any human group still using parts of this landscape, the result would not have been an abstract geological event. It would have entered the body as cold water, unstable ground, broken roots, scattered material, and the urgent need to move towards safety. We cannot know exactly who was there, or whether particular camps were occupied on the day the water came. The evidence does not let us stand beside them, but we can understand the exposure created by the landscape itself. Low places leave little margin. If the sea rises slowly, people can sometimes adjust. If a wave suddenly arrives on top of a long rise, the choices become fewer. This is why Storegga may have mattered so strongly to the final story of Doggerland. It did not need to destroy every remaining place to change the meaning of the whole region. It only needed to make a fragile world less dependable. A remaining island, bank, or coastal flat might have survived physically, yet become less useful for repeated human life. A route across wet ground might still exist in some form, yet no longer be trusted. A fishing or birding place might continue to attract life, yet become too exposed to sudden water or new currents. Human geography is built from trust as much as from land. People return to places because those places have worked before. They sleep where the ground has held them. They cross where others crossed safely. They teach children paths that have meaning because earlier bodies survived them. A tsunami can break that trust quickly. Even after the water withdraws, it can leave behind new channels, salt contamination, debris, erosion, drowned vegetation, and memories of danger. Again, we should not invent the memories themselves, but we can say that repeated use of place depends on confidence, and confidence can be damaged by sudden flooding. In the larger human story, this is one of the quiet ways environment shapes generations. A group may not need to vanish for history to change. It may only need to stop returning to a place. It may choose a safer shore, a higher ridge, a route farther inland, or contact with people in more stable areas. Over time, such choices change where children are born, where skills are learned, and which landscapes remain part of living knowledge. For the future Britain, this process matters because Doggerland had been the fading middle ground between island and continent. As that middle ground became less habitable, Britain's separation became more real in practice. The water did not simply draw a line, it removed the ordinary spaces through which people, animals, and habits could pass. Storegga arrived as a sudden force within that longer removal. It may have flooded remaining low areas, disturbed coastal habitats, and helped end the usefulness of places that were already close to being lost. But the most truthful way to hold the event is with balance. The wave was powerful, but it was not the sole author of Britain's islandhood. The long rise of the sea had written most of the story. The wave may have pressed harder on the final pages. Beneath today's North Sea, the traces of that older world are not arranged like a simple disaster scene. They belong to a longer transformation: ice retreating, water rising, land shrinking, habitats shifting, people adapting, and then a distant seabed collapse sending energy across the ocean. In that sequence, the creation of Britain becomes more than a dramatic headline. It becomes a lesson in timing. A single event can seem to define history when it strikes at the moment a system is already weakened. Doggerland was not swallowed because one wave invented the sea. It was vulnerable because the sea had been coming for generations. Storegga's importance lies in arriving when there was so little lowland left to lose. The title says that a single wave swallowed an entire continent, but the truthful story is more careful and in many ways more powerful. Doggerland was not a continent in the strict geological sense, and it was not lost only in one violent moment. It was a large lowland, once exposed because sea levels were lower, and it was gradually drowned as the world warmed after the last ice age. For thousands of years, water rose into basins, river mouths, marshes, and low coasts. The land between the future Britain and the European continent became smaller, wetter, and more fragmented. By the time the Storegga tsunami arrived from the north, much of the older landscape had already been changed or lost. The wave did not create the whole process. It entered it late. Yet that does not make the wave unimportant. A final blow can matter greatly when a place has already been weakened. A tree may stand through many seasons of rot and wind before one storm brings it down. In the same way, Doggerland may have endured slow flooding for generations before a sudden surge damaged what remained. The distinction matters because exaggeration can make history feel exciting for a moment, but accuracy makes it last. The real drama is not that the sea appeared from nowhere. The real drama is that human beings were living in a world where the ground beneath their roots was being steadily withdrawn, and then a sudden wave may have struck that already fragile world. For Mesolithic people, this difference between slow loss and sudden shock would have entered life through the body. A slowly rising sea could be answered with movement, caution, and changed habits. A camp could shift to higher ground. A route could be avoided in wet seasons. A fishing place could be used differently as water deepened. A group could adjust its pattern of return. But a tsunami is different. It compresses change into a moment. It does not ask whether a place had been useful before. It pushes across lowland, carries debris, disturbs sediments, floods channels, and turns known ground into uncertain ground. In a landscape like Lake Doggerland, already low and broken by water, even one event could make remaining areas less safe for repeated use. This does not mean every last human being there was swept away or that every remaining patch vanished at once. The evidence does not allow such a claim. Some places may have already been abandoned, some may have been used seasonally, some higher areas may have survived physically for a time. The careful question is not whether the wave erased a complete civilization in one instant. The careful question is whether it helped end the usefulness of the last lowland spaces that still linked Britain to the continent. That question keeps the story close to what can be responsibly said. It also keeps the human meaning clear. A landscape does not have to vanish completely to stop being a homeland. It only has to become too risky, too broken, or too difficult to depend on. If a route can no longer be trusted, if a camp floods too often, if animals change their paths, if fresh water becomes harder to find, then people must turn elsewhere. The origin of Britain as an island lies in this gradual turning. Water changed the routes of bodies before it changed the categories of maps. People did not wake one morning inside a country called Britain, separated forever from Europe. They lived through smaller realities, a crossing deeper than before, a low place lost, a shore moved inland, a familiar horizon altered by water. Storegga may have made some of those realities sudden. It may have transformed already fragile land into a place no longer worth returning to. But it should be understood as part of a longer sequence, not a lone miracle of destruction. The phrase swallowed a continent is useful only if we hear it as a doorway into a deeper truth. The sea can erase a world without erasing it all at once, and one violent wave can become memorable because it arrives near the end of a long disappearance. Doggerland's loss was therefore both slow and sudden. Slow in the way ice melt and rising seas redrew the North Sea basin across generations. Sudden in the way a distant seabed collapse may have sent water across the remaining lowlands. Britain was created through both kinds of time, the patient time of climate and the brief time of catastrophe. The wave did not invent the island, but it may have helped close the last passage. A great wave does not leave only water behind. It can leave a landscape rearranged, stripped, buried, salted, and made unfamiliar. If the Storegga tsunami reached the remaining low areas of Doggerland, its consequences would have depended on the exact shape of the ground. Water does not move across every coast in the same way. It follows channels, spreads through basins, rushes over low ridges, slows in marshes, and carries sand, mud, broken plants, shells, bones, and debris into places where they were not before. In a high landscape, the damage may be limited by elevation. In a flat wetland, the same surge can travel much farther. Lake Doggerland was exactly the kind of place where water could matter deeply. Low, wet, already divided by channels, and already losing ground to the sea. The wave's immediate effect may have been flooding, but the deeper effect may have been the loss of reliability. A camp does not need to be buried forever to become unusable. If salt water crosses it, if debris covers it, if freshwater sources are damaged, if the ground becomes unstable, if the route to it is cut, then human life must recalculate. For people living by seasonal movement, these practical changes could be serious. A place used in spring might no longer be safe. A fishing edge might be altered by sediment. A bank where animals crossed might be eroded. A patch of woodland near a wetland might be flooded or left surrounded by difficult ground. Tools, stored materials, shelters, and signs of earlier use could be scattered or hidden. Archaeology may find traces of disturbance, but it cannot always tell us whose life was interrupted or how many people were present. That silence must be respected. Still, the environmental consequences can be understood without inventing a dramatic scene. A tsunami is a force that changes the arrangement of land and water very quickly, and for people whose survival depends on close knowledge of arrangement, that speed matters. The human body knows landscape through repetition. It learns where feet can land, where water deepens, where firewood stays dry, where food appears, where children can wait, and where night can be passed with some sense of safety. A sudden flood can break that knowledge in one day. After the water withdraws, the land may remain, but it is no longer the same land. A familiar hollow may hold salt water, a path may be cut by a new channel, a marsh may smell different, a dry rise may be smaller. The ordinary confidence that allows people to return may be weakened. This is one of the quietest consequences of disaster. It can turn home into a question. In the wider story of Britain's creation, this matters because Doggerland was already becoming marginal. It was no longer the broad connected world of earlier post-glacial centuries. It had become a shrinking middle ground between the future island and the continent. If the tsunami damaged some remaining lowland zones, it may have accelerated a decision that the rising sea had already been forcing, to live elsewhere, to move toward higher land, to rely on different routes, or to treat water as a more serious boundary. This should not be misunderstood as a single migration story with clear names and dates. The evidence does not allow us to describe one group leaving one place on one morning. More likely, the change would have belonged to many decisions, some made before the wave, some after it, some forced by flooding, others by the slow loss of usefulness. The wave may have destroyed certain coastal or low-lying places, but it may also have changed how people judge the future of the remaining land. A landscape that has failed once can fail again. For small communities, that possibility can matter as much as physical damage. Food, safety, and social contact all depend on risk. If a route becomes too uncertain, people may stop using it. If a meeting place becomes too exposed, contact patterns may shift. If animals avoid changed ground, hunters must follow different signs. If fresh water becomes harder to trust, camps must move. Each consequence is ordinary, but together they can reshape a population's relationship with place. The wave's importance, then, lies not only in what it covered, but in what it may have made impossible to continue. It could have turned already fragile coast and wetland into a landscape of warning. It could have erased surfaces where evidence might once have remained. It could have helped push human activity away from the last low spaces between Britain and Europe. None of this requires exaggeration. It does not require saying that an entire people vanished in one instant. It only requires seeing that human life depends on dependable ground. When that ground is low, shrinking, and then struck by sudden water, the future changes. The creation of Britain was not simply the sea drawing a border around an island. It was the slow removal of usable connections, and perhaps, in the end, the sudden damage of a wave that made some of those connections no longer worth the risk. The question that remains is whether the Storegga wave directly ended the last human life on Doggerland, or whether it only marked one severe moment in a longer disappearance that had already gone too far to reverse. The careful answer is that we do not know enough to choose the most dramatic version. The evidence supports a large tsunami. It supports a shrinking Doggerland. It supports a long rise of the sea after the last ice age. It supports the presence of Mesolithic people in the wider North Sea world. But it does not let us watch the final day of the lowland as if we stood there with clear eyes. That missing view matters. Without it, we should not say that one wave killed everyone, or that one wave alone created Britain. We should say something quieter and more precise. A powerful wave arrived when the remaining low country was already weakened by centuries of flooding, and it may have made parts of that world impossible, unsafe, or no longer worth returning to. In human terms, that may be enough to change history. A place does not have to be completely erased in one day to stop serving as a bridge. It only has to lose the qualities that made it useful: safe routes, fresh water, predictable food, places to sleep, places to meet, and ground that can be trusted under the feet. Doggerland had once offered these things across a wide zone between the future Britain and the continent. As the sea rose, that zone narrowed. As marshes spread and channels deepened, movement became more complicated. As coasts shifted, animal paths and human paths shifted with them. Then a tsunami may have crossed some of the remaining low ground and pushed the old system closer to its end. This is a more truthful kind of drama than a simple tale of sudden destruction. It shows how human worlds can be lost through layers of change, some slow enough to be absorbed, some sudden enough to break the pattern. For people living at the edge of this transformation, the final meaning would not have been written as geology. It would have appeared in practical facts. A known place could not be reached. A route had changed. A camp was no longer dry. A wetland gave different food. A shoreline had moved. A crossing had become too dangerous. A group that once had choices across land might now have to choose higher ground, a new coast, or a different direction of travel. These changes connect back to the deep origin of human life, because our species became human not by standing outside nature, but by remembering useful places within it. The mind, the body, and the group work together to make landscapes livable. A child learned where to step because someone older had stepped there before. A hunter watched animals because past seasons had taught what signs mattered. A fire was made in a place because that place had kept people warm before. When the sea takes such places, it takes more than soil. It takes the framework through which experience becomes knowledge. That is why the question of the last Doggerland is difficult. The wave may have been a physical event, but its human meaning depended on what remained to be lost. If there were still communities using low areas, the shock could have been severe. If some places were only visited seasonally, the wave could still have ended those visits. If higher patches survived, they may have become isolated or less useful. If no one was present in a particular flooded area, the event could still have reshaped future routes and habitats. Each possibility changes the story slightly, and none should be claimed beyond the evidence. What we can see is the larger movement. Britain's separation from Europe became more real as the shared land between them disappeared. The Storegga wave belongs to that movement as a possible closing force, not as the only author. It stands near the edge between connected land and island world, between a place that could be walked and a distance that required water crossing. For later history, this mattered deeply. Britain would not be sealed away forever. People, animals, materials, and ideas would continue to cross seas in later ages, but something older had ended. The ordinary land connection had faded. The broad lowland that once carried life between east and west had become seabed. A single wave may not have swallowed an entire continent in the strict sense, but it may have struck the last fragile remains of a human landscape already being taken by the sea. And that leaves us with a question that cannot be closed too quickly. When does a homeland truly disappear? When the water first reaches it, when the last people leave it, or when no living memory can still find the path back? When Britain became an island, it did not happen because a border suddenly appeared around it. It happened because the land that had once connected it to the European continent was taken away, slowly and unevenly, by the rising sea. The future island had always had high ground, rivers, valleys, forests and coasts of its own, but its eastern side had not always faced the open North Sea in the way it does today. For a long time after the last ice age, the space between eastern Britain and the continent included low country, wetland, river systems and changing shorelines. Doggerland was part of that space. As sea levels rose, the lowland narrowed, channels widened, basins filled, marshes became tidal, dry routes became uncertain. What had once been a broad zone of movement became a broken landscape of water and remaining ground. Eventually, the old land connection was no longer a dependable way between Britain and Europe. This is the quiet moment in which islandhood begins, not when people name an island, but when ordinary walking routes are replaced by water. For human beings, that change was immense. A body that can walk across land faces one kind of distance. A body that must cross water faces another. Water demands timing, skill, materials, weather, knowledge, and risk. It can connect skilled people, but it does not connect in the same way as continuous ground. Before the separation was complete, A person moving westward through the lowlands could pass through environments that changed gradually. Marsh, riverbank, woodland, higher soil, and open ground. After the separation, that passage required a different relationship with the sea. Britain did not become unreachable, and it would be wrong to imagine it as sealed away. Later human history shows many crossings, contacts, migrations, exchanges, and arrivals by water. But the older condition had changed. The land itself no longer offered the same shared field of movement. That shift affected people, animals, plants, and the spread of habits across generations. Some animals that could once move across dry or partly dry land would face greater limits. Some plants would spread differently. Human groups would still adapt, but contact between the island and the continent would depend more heavily on coastal knowledge and water travel. In this way, geography became a quiet force in population history. It did not decide everything, but it changed the available choices. The origin of Britain as an island, therefore, belongs to the same deep pattern that shaped early human life everywhere. Bodies learning the limits of landscapes. Our species did not begin by controlling the shape of continents. People survived by reading the world as it was given to them, and by adjusting when that world changed. Doggerland's disappearance forced a new reading. A path that once made sense through low ground could no longer be taught in the same way. A direction that once meant travel across land began to mean a shore, a crossing, a horizon of water. A child born after the final loss would inherit a different map from one born before it. The separation became normal only after memory adjusted to the new coastline. This is why modern maps can mislead the imagination. They show Britain already surrounded by sea, as if islandhood were ancient beyond change. But the seabed beneath the North Sea holds another truth. Britain's island identity was made through climate, melting ice, rising water, sediment, storm, and perhaps one great wave arriving near the end of the old lowlands life. The process was not clean. It did not draw a perfect line in one day. It removed the middle ground piece by piece, until the future island stood apart in practice. What had once been a connected edge of Europe became a place defined more strongly by surrounding water. Yet even then, the story was not isolation alone. An island is never only a prison of water. It is also a place with shores, crossings, arrivals, and departures. Britain's later history would grow from that tension, separated enough for islandhood to matter, connected enough for the sea to remain a road. The first step in that long history was the drowning of the land between. Beneath the waves, Doggerland became the missing page between Britain as part of a wider ground and Britain as an island world. Islandhood changes life by changing the cost of movement. When Britain was still connected to the continent through the lowlands of Doggerland, people, animals, and plants could spread through a landscape of many small transitions. A route might pass from woodland to marsh, from marsh to riverbank, from riverbank to higher ground, without requiring a crossing over deep open water. Once the old lowland disappeared, movement did not stop, but it became filtered through the sea. This difference matters biologically and socially. A deer can follow land more easily than water. A plant can spread through connected habitats more easily than across a channel of salt water. Human beings can cross water with skill, planning, and tools, but even for humans, the sea changes timing, danger, and frequency. A journey that once belonged to walking becomes a journey that depends on weather, craft, visibility, currents, and the ability to carry people and things safely. In this way, the drowning of Doggerland did not simply draw water around Britain. It changed the rhythm by which life could arrive, leave, and return. For human populations, this would have affected contact rather than ending it. Britain was never outside the human world. People continued to live there, adapt there, and later connect with the continent in many ways. But the older ease of land movement was gone. A group on the future island could no longer rely on a broad lowland as a normal space of seasonal travel. Contact across the water may still have happened, and later evidence from many periods shows that seas can be crossed repeatedly. Yet water makes contact more selective. It may reduce casual meetings. It may make some exchanges more planned. It may give greater importance to coastal knowledge, boat use, and the ability to judge safe conditions. Over generations, such changes can affect population structure, Some communities may become more locally focused. Some links with the continent may thin. Other links, especially along coasts, may become more important. These patterns should be described carefully because the evidence does not allow us to trace every family line or every journey. But the general principle is strong. When geography changes the route, it also changes the pattern of human contact. The same is true for animals and plants. Britain's separation helped shape which species could naturally reach the island and which became limited by water. Some animals already present could continue to live there if conditions suited them. Others, unable to cross easily after the land bridge was gone, would no longer move freely between Britain and Europe. Plant communities also responded to climate, soil and dispersal, but surrounding water added a new boundary. This does not mean Britain became a closed biological container. Birds fly. Seeds can travel by wind, water and animals. Humans can carry materials, animals and ideas. Still, the sea alters probabilities. It turns a simple spread across land into a more difficult crossing. The origin of Britain as an island is therefore also a story about filtering. Filtering movement, filtering contact, filtering the ways bodies and landscapes meet. This connects back to the deep human beginning of the story, because our species has always lived through pathways. Human life is not only a matter of where people stand, but of where they can go from there. A child's world is shaped by the routes adults can safely take. A community's future is shaped by who it can meet, what materials it can obtain, and which places remain within reach. Before Doggerland vanished, the future Britain was one western part of a wider field. After the separation, it became a place where the shoreline carried new importance. The sea became both edge and road, both limit and possibility. That double meaning would echo through later history, but its roots lie much earlier, in the slow drowning of the lowland beneath the North Sea. The biological meaning of islandhood is not isolation in a pure sense. It is changed connection. The social meaning is similar. A group may still belong to a larger human world, but the effort required to maintain that belonging is different. Distance becomes heavier when it includes water. Knowledge must adjust. Tools must adjust. Seasonal habits must adjust. Even memory must adjust because older routes no longer match the ground. The creation of Britain was therefore not only the making of an island on a map, it was the making of a new set of conditions for life. The sea did not erase all connection, but it made every connection pass through a different question. Can this crossing be made, and what must be risked to make it? Britain's later history is often told through the sea. Ships arriving, ships leaving, armies crossing, traders landing, languages changing, people looking outward from an island edge. But before any of those later stories could happen, the island itself had to be made. That making began in deep time, when the land between Britain and Europe was lost beneath rising water. The disappearance of Doggerland did not decide all later history, and it would be misleading to say that one prehistoric flood created everything that followed. Human societies are shaped by many forces: climate, food, technology, belief, conflict, cooperation, chance and memory. Yet geography sets conditions before people build meanings on top of them. Once Britain was separated by sea, every later contact with the continent had to pass through that fact. Water became part of the island's identity, not because people chose it, but because the earth had changed. In this sense, the story of Doggerland is not only about a lost prehistoric lowland, it is also about the beginning of a long relationship between Britain and the surrounding sea. The same water that cut away the old land connection would later become a road for movement. This is one of the quiet paradoxes of island history. The sea separates, but it also connects. It makes ordinary walking impossible, but it allows skilled crossings. It limits some animals and plants, but it carries boats, ideas, objects and people. Britain's later position in the world cannot be explained only by its island shape. Yet that shape mattered. It made coastlines important. It made harbours important. It made crossing knowledge important. It made arrival and departure feel different from movement across open land. Long before written kingdoms, before Roman roads, before medieval ports, before modern nations, this condition had already been prepared by melting ice and rising seas. The creation of Britain as an island was therefore a foundation laid far below the visible surface of history. It belongs to the older human story in which landscapes guide the possibilities of life. For Mesolithic people, the new separation would have been practical rather than symbolic. They did not know they were living at the opening of an island history. They faced questions of food, shelter, safety, movement, and contact. But over time, practical facts become inherited worlds. Children born after the last land connection was gone would grow into a geography where the eastern horizon meant water. They would not need to remember Doggerland for Doggerland to matter. Its absence shaped the routes available to them. Its drowning changed what could be reached on foot. Its loss turned a shared lowland into a submerged past. Later generations might develop new skills for water, new relationships with coasts, and new patterns of connection. But the older broad passage had ended. This is why Doggerland is so important when we ask how Britain was created. The answer is not only that the sea rose. The answer is that a world of ordinary movement disappeared, and in its place came a different geography of human possibility. The future island was not cut off from the world, but it was set apart in a new way. That difference could echo through animal populations, plant dispersal, human contact, settlement choices, and eventually the deeper cultural imagination of living on land surrounded by water. Still, the story must remain balanced. Britain did not become important because it was isolated, and it did not become unique because Doggerland vanished. No landscape carries a single destiny. What Doggerland's loss did was alter the starting conditions. It changed the questions that later people had to answer. How do we cross? Where do we land? What comes by water? What remains beyond it? These questions would take many forms across thousands of years, but their earliest roots lay in the disappearance of the ground beneath the North Sea. The Storegga wave, if it damaged the final fragile lowlands, belongs to that root system as a sudden force near the end of a slow transformation. The sea had already been working for generations. The wave may have helped close a passage that climate had been narrowing for a long time. From that closing came a new shape on the edge of Europe, not separate from history, not sealed from movement, but surrounded by a boundary that would have to be crossed with intention. Britain was created not simply when water covered land, but when water changed the meaning of distance. People may have seen the sea take parts of Doggerland, but we must be careful with the word seen. They did not see the whole process from above, as we do when we look at maps of a drowned landscape. They could only experience local change, water reaching a familiar bank, a marsh growing wider, a crossing becoming unreliable, a storm leaving salt and debris where dry ground had been. If the Storegga wave struck areas still used by people, some may have witnessed sudden flooding with their own eyes. Yet we cannot know who they were, where they stood, or what meaning they gave to it. This limit is important because a lost land naturally pulls the imagination towards stories of fear, grief, escape, and memory. Those may be possible human responses, but they are not directly preserved in the seabed. What survives is quieter. Layers of sediment, traces of old environments, and evidence that the world between Britain and Europe had once been land. Still, even without inventing their thoughts, we can understand the human scale of the change. A shoreline moving inland is not only a line on earth. It changes where the body can rest, where children can be led, where food can be found, where older people can travel, and where one group might meet another. The people of the Mesolithic world lived by knowledge passed through use. They knew places by returning to them, and such knowledge can be disturbed when the places themselves alter. A person could remember a dry path after that path had become wet. A group could approach a known place and find it changed. A child could grow up hearing directions that no longer matched the ground. This is not the same as saying we know their stories. It is saying that environmental change always enters human life through practical memory. Doggerland's disappearance may have left some kind of memory among people who lived through its later stages, but memory before writing is difficult to follow. It does not remain in a straight line for thousands of years unless carried, reshaped, and attached to later meanings. We should not claim that a modern or ancient flood story is automatically a record of Doggerland. That would be too easy, and too careless. Human communities in many parts of the world have lived near rivers, coasts, storms, tsunamis, and rising waters. Flood memories can arise from many real experiences. Some may preserve fragments of older events. Others may speak more broadly about danger, renewal, punishment, survival, or the power of water. Doggerland gives us a real drowned landscape, but it does not give us a direct voice from the people who watched it change. The beginning of Britain as an island therefore rests between memory and silence. The land was real, the loss was real. Human beings almost certainly had to adjust to it, but the inner life of that adjustment is mostly beyond our reach. This should not make the story smaller, it makes it more respectful. The people who lived near the fading lowland were not there to provide dramatic scenes for us. They were living their own lives in a world whose shape was changing. They may have carried memories of lost ground for a time. They may have taught warnings about dangerous water or certain shores. They may have simply moved on, because survival required attention to the next place. We do not know. What we do know is that the sea eventually covered the middle ground, and later generations inherited an island without needing to remember the passage that had vanished beneath it. In that sense, Doggerland is a lesson in how human history can be shaped by events that leave no clear human sentence behind. A continent edge became an island edge, and somewhere in that transformation, lived experience faded into silence under the North Sea. Flood stories appear in many human traditions, and it is tempting to connect every one of them to a real drowned landscape. Doggerland makes that temptation stronger, because here the lost land was not imaginary. A broad, low country truly did exist where the North Sea lies today. The sea truly did rise after the last ice age. A major tsunami truly did move through parts of the North Atlantic world around 8,200 years ago. These facts can make the mind leap toward a simple idea. Perhaps later stories of great floods are memories of this one ancient loss. But history becomes weaker when it moves too quickly from possibility to certainty. The safer truth is that many societies remember floods because many societies have lived near water. Rivers overflow, coasts retreat, storm surges arrive, tsunamis strike without warning, lakes burst through natural barriers, ice melts. Rain fails, then returns too heavily. Human beings have always settled near water because water feeds life, supports plants and animals, offers travel, and makes survival possible. The same water can also destroy shelter, drown paths, ruin stored food, and carry away familiar ground. It is therefore not surprising that flood stories are widespread. Water is one of the oldest human teachers and one of the oldest human dangers. Doggerland may belong to this wider pattern, but it should not be treated as the single source behind every later memory of flood. The distance in time is enormous. The people who lived through the final stages of Doggerland left no written account. Later flood stories were shaped inside particular cultures, languages, religions, landscapes, and moral worlds. Some speak of divine judgment, some speak of survival, some speak of renewal after destruction. Some may preserve echoes of real local events. Others may express a broad human awareness that water can erase what feels permanent. To collapse all of them into one prehistoric event would not honour their differences, and it would not honour the evidence. The story of Doggerland is strong enough without forcing it to explain every flood remembered by humanity. Its importance lies in showing that real landscapes can disappear so completely that later people may not even know they were ever there. This connects back to the beginning of Britain's island history. The people who adapted to the drowning of Doggerland may have carried memories for a time, perhaps in warnings, routes avoided, or stories attached to dangerous shores. But we cannot follow those memories across thousands of years with confidence. Oral memory can be powerful, but it changes as it passes from one generation to another. It can preserve a core, reshape a place, merge events, or become part of a different meaning. A story told beside one coast can absorb lessons from another. A real flood can become a moral lesson. A local event can become a world event in the imagination. This does not make such stories false in a simple sense. It means they operate differently from sediments, tools, and mapped river channels. They belong to human meaning, not only to geological record. When we study Doggerland, the strongest evidence remains physical. Drowned landforms, sediments, environmental traces, and artifacts. These tell us that Britain was once connected to the continent through a low, living landscape. They tell us that rising seas gradually removed that connection. They tell us that the Storegga tsunami may have struck remaining vulnerable areas. They do not tell us that a particular later myth is a direct memory of that moment. For a truthful sleep history, this boundary matters. It protects the story from becoming too neat. Human history is rarely neat. It is made from overlapping layers, real events, lived experience, damaged evidence, later memory, and the meanings people build around danger. Doggerland stands at the meeting point of those layers. It is a real drowned land, but also a reminder that not every loss becomes a clear story. Some losses become silence. Some become changed routes. Some become habits whose origin is forgotten. Some may become stories, but the path from event to story can be long, broken, and impossible to prove. The deep lesson is not that all civilizations remembered Doggerland. The lesson is that many human communities have known the power of water closely enough to make flood a lasting image of vulnerability. For the people near the fading North Sea lowland, water was not a symbol first. It was cold, moving, practical, and dangerous. It could feed them, block them, carry them, and take away the ground that joined one place to another. Later generations across the world would also learn, in their own landscapes, that water can redraw human life. Doggerland belongs to that larger human knowledge, but it remains its own careful story. A lost lowland, a rising sea, a possible final wave, and a Britain slowly becoming an island beneath the patient pressure of water. The deepest honesty in the story of Doggerland is that some of it must remain unknown. This is not a weakness in the history. It is the condition that makes the history truthful. The seabed gives us evidence, but it does not give us everything. It can show old river channels, drowned surfaces, pollen, sediments, animal remains, and human-made tools. It can show that a lowland once connected Britain with the continent, and that this lowland was gradually lost as the sea rose after the last ice age. It can also show that a powerful tsunami from the north reached parts of the region at a time when the remaining land was already vulnerable. But it cannot show every family, every movement, every warning, or every memory. It cannot tell us how people explained the water, or whether they thought of the loss as an ending, a danger, a change of route, or simply one more hardship in a life already tied to weather and season. To pretend otherwise would make the story smoother, but less true. The people of the Mesolithic world deserve better than invented certainty. They were real human beings, not empty figures waiting to be placed inside a modern disaster scene. Their lives were probably shaped by skill, attention, hunger, care, fear, sleep, learning, and the need to stay close enough to others for knowledge to survive. Those are human foundations we can understand without claiming to know their private thoughts. The origin of Britain as an island lies exactly at this boundary between what can be known and what must be left open. We know the land connection vanished. We know that water changed the map of life. We know that roots, animal movements, plant communities, and human contact would have been affected by the loss of the lowland, but the specific human experience of that loss is mostly silent. That silence should not be filled too quickly. It should be allowed to remain, because silence is also evidence of how much of human history was lived without writing, without monuments, and without permanent marks strong enough to survive the sea. For a long time, people lived in places that left almost nothing behind. They made fires whose ashes gone. They slept on ground now buried or drowned. They taught children paths that no longer exist. They used tools that may never be found. They may have remembered lost places for a few generations, or perhaps the memory changed until it no longer pointed clearly to any one shoreline. We do not know. What remains is the larger truth. Human beings have always lived inside landscapes that could change beyond their control. Doggerland is one clear example, because its disappearance helped turn Britain from connected land into island. It teaches that history is not made only by events we can name. It is also made by slow pressures that alter what is possible. A sea rising a little more, a route becoming unsafe, a wetland growing wider, a wave crossing a low shore, a generation learning a smaller map than the one before. These changes may leave few words, but they can shape the future deeply. This is why the limits of evidence are not the end of the story. They are part of its meaning. They remind us to respect the past without owning it completely. Doggerland was real. The loss was real. The human presence around it was real. Yet the final details remain underwater, and perhaps they should. In that restraint, the listener can meet the past without forcing it to speak more loudly than the evidence allows today. Not every vanished world can be turned into a complete answer. Some must remain as a careful outline, held between mud, bone, stone, water, and the quiet knowledge that what created Britain also erased much of the path that led there. Doggerland belongs to a much larger human story than the story of Britain alone. After the last ice age, people across many regions were living through a world that was changing its shape. Ice that had held water away from the oceans was melting. Seas were rising. Rivers were finding new courses. Forests were spreading into lands that had once been more open. Animals were shifting with plants, water, temperature, and season. Human groups moved within these changes, not as spectators, but as living bodies whose survival depended on reading what the ground, the weather, and other living things were doing. In this broad post-glacial world, Doggerland was one example of a deeper pattern. Human life was tied to landscapes that had never promised to stay the same. The lowland between Britain and Europe was rich because it contained edges, and edges often gather life. Rivers met wetlands, wetlands met dry rises, woodland opened toward marsh, fresh water approached salt water. Such places could support fish, birds, mammals, plants, and human movement. But the same conditions that made the lowland useful also made it vulnerable. When the sea rose, the edges moved. When the edges moved, the habits of life had to move with them. This is not only a regional story, it reaches back into the foundations of what humans are. Our species became successful not because the Earth was stable, but because human beings could learn, cooperate, remember, adjust, and teach across generations. A person alone could notice a change. A group could turn that notice into survival. But no skill made people immune to the slow force of climate and water. Doggerland shows both sides of human adaptation, its strength and its limit. People could respond to a changed marsh, a new shore, a lost crossing, or a different animal route. They could not stop the sea from returning to a low basin once global conditions had changed. This is why the making of Britain as an island should be placed inside the wider history of the early Holocene, the warm period after the last glacial age. Across the world, coastlines were being redrawn as water rose. Places that had been plains became bays. Valleys became estuaries. Old shorelines moved inland. Low areas disappeared. Human communities near coasts and rivers had to live with these changes long before written history began. Some may have benefited for a time from new wetlands and coasts. Others may have lost ground, roots, and reliable places. The process was not simple progress or simple disaster. It was a rearrangement of possibility. Doggerland's importance is that it makes this rearrangement visible beneath a modern sea. It reminds us that the map we inherit is only one moment in a longer movement. What looks permanent today may have been different when earlier human bodies walked, hunted, gathered, carried children, made tools, and looked for safe places to sleep. Britain did not begin its human story as an isolated island standing apart from Europe. It began within a changing borderland, where land and water were slowly exchanging places. When Doggerland vanished, it did not remove all contact between Britain and the continent. It changed the conditions of contact. Walking routes became water routes. Local knowledge had to adjust to shorelines. Animal and plant movement met new limits. Human groups inherited a geography in which the sea became more central. This connects Doggerland to the long history of human resilience. But resilience should not be romanticized. To endure change does not mean nothing is lost. A community can survive while losing a place. A people can adapt while a familiar world disappears. A child can grow into a new coastline without knowing the old one was once dry ground. This is one of the quiet truths of history before writing. Enormous changes can become ordinary for those born after them. The seabed beneath the North Sea holds a record of one such change. It shows that the origins of Britain's island story lie not in kings, battles, or written borders, but in melting ice, moving water, drowned land, and the patient work of generations learning a world that would not remain still. Doggerland was not the only low landscape touched by the rising seas after the last ice age. Around the world, coastlines shifted as meltwater returned to the oceans and the shape of human life changed with them. In some places, plains became shallow seas. In others, river valleys became estuaries, and older shorelines moved far inland from where people had once known them. The details were different in every region, because every coast has its own shape, its own sediments, its own tides, its own storms, and its own human histories. But the broad pattern is familiar. When water rises into low ground, it does not only cover land. It changes movement, food, contact, and memory. This is why Doggerland can be compared gently with other drowned or transformed coastal zones, not to claim that all places shared the same story, but to understand a common human condition. People often live near water because water brought life close. Rivers carried fish, wetlands attracted birds, estuaries joined fresh and salt resources, coasts offered shellfish, driftwood, travel routes, and seasonal abundance. Yet the same places that fed people could become unstable when climate changed. A useful edge could become a dangerous edge. A familiar shore could become a channel. A valley could become a bay. A camp placed near water for good reason could become too low, too wet, or too exposed for the next generation. The human body would have known these changes before any later map recorded them. Feet met softer ground. Hands carried tools farther. Eyes watched water reach beyond its older limit. Children learned a coastline different from the one held in older memory. In many parts of the post-glacial world, human communities had to live with this kind of adjustment. Some losses were gradual enough for people to shift routes and camps over time. Some may have been sharpened by storms, floods, or sudden coastal events. Some changed the balance between inland life and shoreline life. Some opened new fishing grounds while closing old paths. This is why drowned landscapes should not be treated only as tragedies. They were also transformations. A marsh created by rising water could offer food. A new estuary could become productive. A new coastline could draw people toward different skills. But gain in one direction could still mean loss in another. A place that becomes rich for fish may no longer work as a crossing. A shore that feeds people may also divide them. A waterway that connects by boat may block those who once walked. Doggerland's role in this wider pattern is especially clear because it lay between a future island and a continent. Its drowning did not merely move a shoreline, it changed the nature of connection itself. Elsewhere, rising water may have shifted coastal groups inland or reshaped local resources. In the North Sea world, the loss of the lowland helped turn Britain into an island. That made the change both environmental and historical. The new sea did not remove Britain from the human world, but it made access depend more strongly on water crossing. This is a different kind of geography from a continuous land route. It filters contact through skill, weather, materials, and risk. In the long history of our species, such filters matter. Humans are adaptable, but adaptation always begins with what the landscape permits. A group cannot choose an old path once the path lies under deep water. It can only find another way, stay elsewhere, learn new skills, or change its pattern of contact. This is the calm lesson that Doggerland shares with other lowlands touched by post-glacial seas. Human history did not unfold on a fixed stage. The stage itself moved. The ground rose in some places, sank in others, dried, flooded, cracked, softened, and vanished. People responded with movement, memory, tools, cooperation, and caution. Sometimes they followed opportunity. Sometimes they retreated from danger. Sometimes they may have carried memories of lost ground, and sometimes the next generation simply learned the new world as normal. Britain's islandhood is one visible result of this wider post-Ice Age rearrangement. It reminds us that the earliest chapters of human history were written not only in bones and tools, but in coastlines. A shoreline is not just the place where land meets sea. It is a living boundary where food, danger, travel, and memory gather. When that boundary moves, the human world moves with it. Doggerland was one lost boundary among many, but its disappearance changed the shape of northwestern Europe in a way that can still be seen on every modern map. Beneath the North Sea, it remains a quiet example of how water can remove a landscape and still leave its influence behind. The loss of Doggerland reminds us that many turning points in human history began before anyone built a throne, raised an army, or wrote a law. They began with water, ice, soil, weather, plants, animals, and the slow pressure of time. Later history often gives its attention to rulers, battles, migrations with names, and cities that left stone behind. Those things matter, but they rest on older foundations. Before a people can build, trade, fight, farm, sail, or remember itself as belonging to one place, there must first be a place that allows certain kinds of life. Doggerland was one of those places. It did not leave a palace. It did not leave a written border. It did not leave a voice explaining its own disappearance. Yet its presence and loss changed the map on which later human life unfolded. When the lowland between Britain and Europe was gradually drowned, the change did not announce itself as history. It appeared as wet ground, shifting shorelines, altered rivers, changing animal paths, and routes that could no longer be used as before. But these quiet changes helped prepare one of the most important geographical facts of later northwestern Europe. Britain became an island. This is a useful lesson because it lowers the noise around history. Not every great change begins with a dramatic human decision. Some begin when a coastline moves a little farther inland, when a marsh expands, when a crossing grows deeper, when a low plain becomes too fragile to trust. Human beings then respond. They move, adapt, lose, remember, forget, and teach their children a new map. The human story begins again inside those responses. The creation of Britain was therefore not only a matter of water covering land, it was a matter of choices being reshaped by water. A walking route became a crossing, a shared lowland became a sea, a place of contact became a boundary that required skill and intention. Over many generations, such changes can influence who meets, who remains apart, what animals can spread, which plants take root, and which skills become more valuable. This does not mean geography controls everything. People are not simply pushed around by land and sea like objects. They learn, cooperate, invent, and cross limits. But geography sets the first questions. Can this place feed us? Can we return here safely? Can we meet others from here? Can children and elders travel this route? Can animals still be followed? Can water be crossed? When Doggerland disappeared, those questions changed for the people living in and around the future Britain. The deeper lesson is that history is made from the meeting of human ability and environmental condition. Too much focus on human action alone makes the earth seem passive, as if land were only a stage. Too much focus on environment alone makes people seem helpless, as if they had no skill or memory. Doggerland shows a truer middle ground. People were capable, but the sea was powerful. Communities could adapt, but not restore a drowned plain. Knowledge could guide movement, but not hold back post-glacial water. A wave could strike suddenly, but only after centuries of slower change had made the lowland vulnerable. In this balance, the story becomes calmer and more useful. It does not ask us to fear the sea as an enemy. It asks us to understand that human life has always been shaped by relationships with place. The ground beneath us can feel permanent, because one human life is short. A coastline can look ancient because we inherit it already formed, but deep history stretches beyond that feeling. It shows that the map we trust is only a moment in a longer movement. Britain's islandhood, so familiar now, was once unfinished. Before it became a fact, it was a process. Before it became a national setting for later history, it was a slow separation felt through land, water, bodies, animals, and generations. Doggerland's disappearance teaches that the quiet forces of the earth can be as historically important as any empire. Water can redraw contact, ice can prepare a landscape, then release the sea that erases it. Sediment can preserve a faint record after human memory has gone. A vanished lowland can continue to shape the world long after no one can walk across it. This is why the story remains valuable. It gives the listener not a simple disaster, but a deeper way to see human history, as something written together by people and planet, by memory and mud, by adaptation and loss, by the places that remain and the places that sink beyond sight. Beneath the North Sea, the lost landscape has not entirely vanished. It is hidden, but not empty. Under water, under sand, under mud, Under layers moved by tides and storms, there are still the shapes of older rivers, buried valleys, former wetlands, and surfaces that once belonged to air, rain, animals, and human feet. The seabed is not a simple flat floor. It is an archive, though not an archive made for us. It does not store its memories in clear sentences. It holds them in sediments, channels, peat, pollen, bones, shells, and the rare objects shaped by human hands. To read such an archive requires patience. A buried river can tell us that water once flowed across land now drowned. A layer of peat can suggest a marsh or wet environment where plants grew before the sea arrived. Pollen can hint at woodland, grasses, reeds, or changing vegetation. Animal remains can suggest the creatures that move through the wider landscape. A work stone can bring the human presence suddenly close, not as a full biography, but as proof that hands once acted there with skill and purpose. This is where the story of Doggerland returns to its quiet beginning. Before Britain was an island, before the North Sea covered the middle ground, there was a landscape of use, movement, and memory. The seabed now preserves fragments of that older condition. They are incomplete, but they are enough to change how we see the map. What appears today as water was once part of a human world. What appears as separation was once connection. What appears as permanent islandhood was once unfinished geography. This matters because deep history often survives in forms that are easy to overlook. A monument rises and demands attention. A drowned valley asks for listening. A written record explains itself in human language. A sediment core speaks slowly, through layers that must be studied with care. Doggerland's archive is especially fragile because the sea both preserves and disturbs. It can cover old surfaces and protect them from some kinds of destruction, but it can also scatter objects, erode deposits, and make evidence difficult to reach. Fishing, dredging, storms, currents, and modern construction can all disturb the drowned record. Every discovery must therefore be handled with restraint. The goal is not to force the seabed to become a complete story. The goal is to let each trace add its own small piece to the larger pattern. That pattern is already profound. A lowland once lay between Britain and Europe. It supported rivers, wetlands, animals, plants, and human activity. It was gradually reduced as seas rose after the last ice age. A major tsunami may have damaged the remaining fragile spaces. Over time, the shared ground disappeared, and Britain became an island. The seabed still holds parts of that transformation like a quiet memory beneath moving water. For the human story, this is deeply humbling. It reminds us that our origins are not only found in caves, graves, tools, or bones on dry land. They also lie in places we can no longer walk. They lie under coasts that moved, under waters that rose, under landscapes that fed people and then vanished. A person who once crossed a Doggerland river left no name behind, yet the river channel may still remain beneath the sea. A group that once slept on higher ground near a wetland may have left no shelter we can identify, yet the drowned environment still shows that such places existed. The North Sea, then, is not only a barrier between Britain and Europe, it is also the keeper of the passage that came before the barrier. In its hidden flaw, the older relationship between land, water, animals, and people has not been fully erased. It waits as evidence, partial and silent, asking us to remember that the island's first story begins below the waves. To understand Doggerland is to become a little more humble about the ground beneath human history. The land we inherit can feel final, because our own lives are brief. A coastline appears ancient when it has stood throughout everything we remember. A sea looks permanent when no one alive has walked where its water now lies. Yet deep history shows that the Earth's surface is not a fixed stage. It changes slowly, and sometimes suddenly. Ice grows and retreats. Rivers shift. Forests spread. Marshes form. Sea levels rise and fall across spans far longer than a single human memory. Doggerland is one of the clearest reminders that people have always lived inside this moving world. The lowland between Britain and Europe was not only a geological fact, it was a human condition. It shaped where bodies could travel, where animals moved, where food gathered, where groups might meet, and how the future island was connected to the continent. When it vanished, the loss was not only an environmental change, it was a change in the possibilities available to human life. This does not mean we should turn Doggerland into a warning story filled with fear. fear is too narrow for what the evidence asks us to see. The better response is attention. The people of the Mesolithic world did not live with satellites, tide gauges, written climate records, or maps of the seabed. They lived through local signs: wet ground, shifting channels, changing shorelines, altered animal paths, and places that became more difficult to trust. Their knowledge was practical, embodied, and passed through generations. In that way, Doggerland brings the distant past close to the beginning of ourselves. Human beings have always been creatures of place, but never creatures of stillness. We survive by learning our surroundings, and by changing when those surroundings change. Yet the story also reminds us that adaptation has limits. People can move a camp, change a route, follow different resources, and learn a new coast. They cannot always preserve the old world that gave their knowledge its original shape. When the lowland drowned, some part of the human map drowned with it. The lesson is not that nature is cruel, or that people are powerless. The lesson is that human life and planetary change have always been intertwined. Britain's islandhood, so familiar now, began as the result of warming after an ice age, rising seas, low ground losing its place above water, and perhaps a sudden wave arriving when the land was already fragile. Later generations would build histories on that island: settlements, roads, farms, ports, kingdoms, migrations, languages, conflicts, and exchanges. But beneath all of that lies a quieter foundation. Before any written story of Britain, there was a changing relationship between land and sea. Understanding this can make the past more useful, not because it gives simple answers, but because it teaches proportion. Human history is not only the record of what people decide, it is also the record of what landscapes allow, what climates alter, and what water slowly removes. Doggerland asks us to treat the invisible with seriousness. The absence on the map is not empty. Under the North Sea there are traces of a world that once supported life. Its disappearance helped create a new geography, and that geography helped shape many later possibilities. For a listener in the present, the value of this story is calm and clear. It tells us that the world we know was made through change, and that many of the deepest changes did not happen loudly. Some came through rising water over low ground. Some came through generations learning new routes. Some came through a wave from a distant seabed collapse, moving through a sea already taking the land back. Doggerland does not give us a complete human voice, but it gives us a human lesson. It reminds us to look at coastlines, islands, and maps with patience. What seems fixed may have a submerged past. What seems separate may once have been connected. What seems lost may still shape the lives that come after it. Britain was not born from isolation alone. It emerged from a vanished connection, and that connection remains beneath the water as one of the quiet origins of the island world. Doggerland leaves us with a quiet message about the human place on Earth. We often imagine history as something that begins when people build monuments, carve words, draw borders, or leave behind names that later generations can repeat. But much of human history began before any of that. It began with bodies learning ground, with children following adults along safe paths, with hands making tools from stone, bone, wood, and antler, with small groups remembering where water could be found and where danger waited. It began in landscapes that did not know they would one day become archaeological questions. Doggerland was one of those landscapes. It was not a mythic country beneath the sea, and it was not a continent in the strict sense. It was a real lowland world between the future Britain and the European continent, shaped by rivers, wetlands, animals, plants, and human movement. Its disappearance was not a single, simple event, even if one great wave may have helped close its final passage. The sea had been rising for generations. The land had been narrowing. Routes had been changing. Then, perhaps, the Storegga tsunami crossed a fragile remaining world and made some places impossible to trust again. The lesson is not that the ocean is an enemy. The lesson is that human life has always depended on conditions larger than human intention. People can learn, adapt, cooperate, remember, and move, but they live within a planet that also moves. Ice melts, seas rise, coasts shift, rivers change. A place that feeds one generation may become unsafe for another. A path that once joined communities may turn into water. A familiar horizon may become the edge of a different world. Britain's islandhood, so familiar now, began in that kind of change. It was created not only by water covering land, but by water changing what movement meant. Walking became crossing. A lowland became seabed. A shared space became distance. Yet the story is not only about loss, it is also about continuity. People did not stop being human when the land changed. They adjusted. They carried knowledge elsewhere. They learned new coasts, new risks, new routes, and new ways of staying connected. Later histories grew on the island that remained, but beneath them lay an older truth. Before Britain was surrounded by sea, it was part of a wider human landscape. Remembering Doggerland gives value to what is no longer visible. It reminds us that absence can still shape the present. The North Sea is not only water between lands, it is also the place where an older connection rests, below the surface. The drowned rivers and buried sediments do not speak loudly, but they change the meaning of the map. They ask us to see history with patience, not as a chain of sudden certainties, but as a long relationship between people and the world that held them. For the listener, this is perhaps the gentlest truth Doggerland offers. A human life is short, but it is lived on a planet with a deep memory. The ground beneath us may feel permanent, yet it has its own past. The sea before us may seem empty, yet it may cover old paths. What looks like an ending may also become the beginning of another way of living. Britain was shaped by a vanished passage, by rising water, by a wave from the north, and by generations of people whose names are lost but whose world still matters. And if an entire human landscape can disappear beneath the sea and still leave its influence behind, what other beginnings might be hidden under the places we think we already understand?